Rachel, last week we missed the reminder about joining the COP at the end of the discussion. So if we can be sure to highlight that at the end, that would be great, since this is our last session.
Okay. I have the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Rachel Paul with IAAP. Thank you for joining us for our final session in our Strategic Leader in Accessibility. Session 4 is focused on resource engagement. And before we get started today, just a few items to go over. We have closed captioning provided. You can select the closed captioning icon at the bottom of your screen, and also posted in the chat is a link to third-party viewing if you need that. And we also have a sign language interpretation today. All mics are muted to prevent any background noise or disruptions. And today's webinar will be recorded and available on the IAAP YouTube channel. And I'll share that link if you haven't had a chance to subscribe. The previous webinars are also available on the YouTube channel, so you can catch those if you missed them. I'm going to ask that you leave questions today in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those as we go along, and leave the chat for just general discussion or any technical issues that you may be having. I wanted to mention that you can continue the conversation as an IAAP member in our Strategic Leader in Accessibility Community of Practice. And if you're not a member, we can share some information also in the chat on how you can sign up and join and get engaged and involved as well. So I'd like to turn today's program over to Anatoliy, Popko, and Daniel Frank. Thank you so much.
Good morning.
Hello. Well, I guess we'll start with the introduction, if that's okay with everyone. My name is Anatoliy Popko, and I'm from Moscow, Russian Federation. Daniel, what's your name, by the way?
I'm Daniel Frank, and I'm in Florida in the United States.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot for agreeing to answer the questions and to participate in that session. Well, I have to admit that I'm relatively new to the big and interesting world of high-tech accessibility, so to say. And I call myself a disability or accessibility enthusiast. I'm totally blind, so I'm very much fond of accessibility and enjoy its result. If there are any in Russian Federation, I wouldn't say there is a lot of that, so there's a way to go. But I work with Sberbank in Russian. It's a main Russian bank, Russian financial institution, and thankfully, since about like 4 maybe years, it started to treat accessibility very seriously. And so there is a little bit to share in that respect. But basically my role is today to torture you, Daniel, with the questions. And so I beg your pardon in advance. And from what I know, you've been in accessibility field a lot. So can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, it feels like a lifetime. I am currently a compliance officer with Wells Fargo Bank in the United States. And my responsibility is primarily ADA Title III and to some extent also other customer accessibility regulations compliance. My background is kind of varied. I think like a lot of people in accessibility, I came to this through other occupations, largely product management. And I was for many years in product management, which is very much about customer experience, which I think is a good preparation for this. And my education is both a computer science degree as well as a business degree. And I definitely use both of those skills all the time in this role. And I would add, and I think it's relevant to our discussion, during my misspent youth, when I was in computer science graduate school, I found that the computer science department was not as interested in some of my research interests as I was. And I ended up spending about a semester in the industrial engineering department. And at that point was exposed to the work of W. Edwards Deming and total quality management. And I'd almost forgotten about it in a lot of ways until the last year or two, and really came to realize both how influential that was on my approach to accessibility, as well as how much it has to offer us in terms of perspective around accessibility.
And you actually promised to start our today's session with a short story, TQM related.
Yeah, so I don't know how many people on the call are familiar with Deming. He was very well known, I think, in the 70s and 80s, but probably is not as well known now. And Deming began his career, I think, as an academic, and his specialty was quality, and he was concerned about how you produce quality products. And he went to US companies, large US manufacturing companies, and none of them were really very interested. So it was a time when, automobiles were kind of built to be disposable, and that, kind of breaking down quickly was a feature, not a bug. And so he kind of took his show on the road, and he ended up working with Japanese manufacturing companies. And I think people believe that, sort of the origin of quality in Japanese manufacturing is in Japanese culture, and it certainly has a very strong influence. But really, the actual execution came from this American academic who went to work with Japanese auto companies and other manufacturing companies. And this whole idea of sort of Kaizen and continuous quality improvement really originated with his work in total quality management. So the Japanese car companies began importing cars to the United States, and those surprisingly didn't break down right away. And so the American car companies began seeing effects on their sales, and became very concerned that they had better get on this total quality management bandwagon in order to maintain their position in the market. So they hired Deming to come in as a consultant. And there is, it's an apocryphal story. I don't know if it's true or not, but it definitely has made the rounds, that Deming was invited to speak before a group of executives at Ford Motor Company. And and standing up in front of the room, he gave his talk on quality, and then he opened the floor for questions. And the first question, the gentleman in the front row stood up and he said, Dr. Deming, I'm the newly appointed vice president for quality at Ford Motor Corporation. What is the first thing that I need to do? And Deming looked at me and said, resign.
Well, is it the only thing that he's supposed to do?
Yeah, just said, first thing you should do is resign. And of course, he didn't really mean that there shouldn't be anybody doing quality at the top at Ford Motor Company. But his point was, that's W. Edwards Deming is the name of the scholar. But his point was that you don't do quality from the top down. You do quality from the bottom up. And that's the whole idea behind total quality management, is that quality really is done, from the lowest levels up to the top. That doesn't mean you don't need guidance at the top, but it means you don't get quality by putting someone up at the top, whether it's your vice president of quality or whether it is your chief accessibility officer, and then saying, problem solved, now we have an executive in charge, and now we'll get accessibility or quality or whatever it is. And I think they're very similar in that way. We'll talk more during the discussion about what that really means.
But that does sound like quite a sound step. So if a large corporation wants to become accessible, then it's a logical sort of point to appoint the vice president, or just to organize dedicated division, and that division, that all the products from now on will be accessible. So, and you're saying that it doesn't work that way, but is that more or less enough for the first step, or not really?
I think that, and kind of, we'll talk about what I think the steps should be, and you need leadership for that. You need leadership, executive leadership, you need executive support. But you really need to integrate accessibility in a way that in many ways is, I think, similar to the path of industrialization and mass production. That is, I think my sense is that looking at the history of particularly digital accessibility in the industry, it really kind of starts almost as kind of a craft enterprise, right? And so in the old days, right, you had a shoemaker. The shoemaker in the village made shoes. They made and you needed a pair of shoes. You went to the shoemaker. They measured you. They made the shoes. Our colleagues in the UK would call those bespoke shoes, right? And every pair of shoes was made by the shoemaker. The shoemaker was incredibly talented and gifted. They probably had apprenticed with their father, who had apprenticed with their grandfather. They'd probably been a family of shoemakers for generations, and they knew everything there was about making a shoe. And in many ways, what we've started with in accessibility is that our resources, and obviously this is a talk on resources, our resources have primarily been skilled craftspeople. They've been people who knew WCAG. They knew every single success criterion. They knew all the different ways you had to implement the success criteria and how to test for those. They knew how to go into a website and determine whether it was accessible, to do an audit, right? To do, and then to know how to do the remediation. And so they were almost like the people, like the journeyman masons who built the cathedrals in medieval Europe, where if your town needed a cathedral, right, you didn't call the shoemaker and the baker to build the cathedral. You called the masons, and you got on their schedule, and they showed up in your town and they started building your cathedral. And that's kind of how we've done accessibility. We've had that sort of craft model in accessibility where we have very skilled people, and we try to get enough of them, and we try to scatter them through the organization, and then they run from place to place like the masons building the cathedrals and try to build accessibility into people's products. And I think that similar to industrialization, to really scale and to really be sustainable, we need to move from that craft model to a model in which people who know less than those skilled craftspeople are performing part of the task. Just as, we very few cars are handmade anymore, and those are status symbols now. But if you buy a car, typically it was made on an assembly line, and it was made in stages, and people working at each stage, and now the robots who work at each stage, are doing their part of building that car in order to produce the final product. And so my belief from a resource standpoint is that we need to organize resources and accessibility in order to move to a kind of division of labor, assembly line sort of approach, as opposed to this sort of craftsperson approach, because there just aren't enough craftspeople in the world.
That's the first point, and the second one is that when you were talking about buildings and this kind of stuff, building can actually be completed, while if we're talking about digital product and accessibility and in general, that's not a process that can be actually finished. So that is kind of a building that grows with every single day, and it develops, and there's layer after layer, functional additions and various interface additions, and those also need to be taken care of and to be accessible. So that's kind of like also an important point here. If
Absolutely. And I think the building's never really completed, and I think if you stop working on it, it falls down.
Yeah, good point too. Okay. Well, people is the main resource. Is that correct? Is that your idea?
I believe that people are a key resource, but I actually believe that for sustainability, you need a lot more resources than people. You really need process, process, artifacts, tools. And the reason that's so important is because there aren't enough craftspeople, right? We can't turn everybody in the shoe factory into a craft shoemaker, into a bespoke shoemaker, right? They have to know their part well, but that person may not know how to make a whole shoe, and they shouldn't know how to make a whole shoe. People have other jobs to do. And so what we need to look at, and we look at this in manufacturing, is this balance between individual skill and training always plays, I think, looms large in people's minds about, well, we've got to train people. Well, training is one approach, right? But training assumes that what you need to do is you need to incorporate all of the knowledge into the person. And that's really, in many ways, a craft model, right? That says, you know, you're a programmer, or you're a product manager, or you're a visual designer. And in addition to those skills that you've taken years to acquire and that occupy a big part of your brain, I'm now going to give you some training, and you're going to have to learn all this other stuff in order to now incorporate that. And you've got to figure out how to incorporate that into how you do your job. And that's cognitively challenging and often very impractical to do. So what you need to do is you need to look at how could I use other ways of incorporating accessibility knowledge and practice into people's jobs that doesn't involve taking up a lot more space in their head. And we kind of know what those are, right? At the simplest level, it might be checklists, right? Things like checklists. It might be artifacts that have to be filled out, right? As opposed to teaching every designer that they have to be concerned about tab order, you can simply have an artifact that says, here's a tab order spec. You have to fill this out when you do your interaction design, right? And that's pretty straightforward. Another thing is incorporation into standards of various sorts, like design standards. So I was a very interesting, a really great talk at Walmart Digital a few months ago. Well, I guess a year ago now, before we all couldn't get together in person. And they put up a slide that for me was really, really interesting, because on that slide was a set of color combinations. And they said, you know, we tried for years to get people to do color contrast, and we could never get the designers to understand color contrast, which, as we know, that's a success criterion in WCAG. And then we just stuck in the design guide these color combinations and said, you can only use these. And now we have no problems with color contrast, right? Because we didn't try to teach them a new skill or ask them to use a new tool. What we did is we incorporated the accessibility requirements into their existing artifacts and their existing practice in terms that they can understand. And I'll just give one more illustration of that. I was talking to a group of product managers recently, and we were talking about a group with a particular sort of profile around disability and capabilities. And I said to them, you know, really what this, like where we're running into here is you're missing a persona. Having been a product manager, I know product managers often will use personas, which are essentially they're kind of cardboard cutouts of people, in a sense, that where you have a profile of that person. So the persona might be 45 years old, and they work in the controller's office, and they have a couple kids, and they have moderate computer skills, right? So that's a persona, right? And since accessibility is really just user experience, right? I mean, bottom line, accessibility is user experience. It's the user experience of users who may have disabilities. And so what you need in user experience is to have a persona for someone who uses a screen reader, a persona for someone who maybe can't get in a car and drive somewhere in order to receive a service, right? You need those personas included into the ones that you look at as you're looking at your servicing, at your user interaction design, at all the parts of that process of building a new product. And as opposed to, teaching someone and giving them training to make them sensitive to disability, which I think is important, right? But in terms of how they do their job, it's a lot more useful to bring in a subject matter expert long enough to create the proper personas, and then that person leaves and just the normal product management process takes over. And now those people become your human resources, but they don't really know they're your human resources for accessibility. They're just doing their job the way they always did their job. They're just following, they just have some additional things that guide that job in kind of the normal channels. And I'll just one more story, which is I was working with someone who was working on design standards, and they asked me to take a look at their design standards. They were very proud of the fact that there was a whole section in their design standards for accessibility. And I looked at it and they said, well, what do you think? I said, well, you really need to remove that section. I said, well, what do you mean I need to remove the section? I said, if you have a section for accessibility, first of all, it's a new topic, right? Second of all, what's the message to the designers? Right? The message to the designers, it's usually at the end, right? It's like after everything else, at the end is the accessibility section, right? And what does that say, right? I'm busy. I have a lot of demands on my time. I'm under pressure for time and budget and everything else. Oh, here's the stuff at the end. I won't do that this time. And the psychological effect is really important, right? You have to think about the psychology of how people respond to these things. And what you need to do is you need to take that section, you need to break that up into multiple sections. And they said, well, what about reading order and tab order? I said, have a section called considerations for keyboard interaction. Not accessibility, not disability, considerations for keyboard interaction. Now, keyboard interaction is one of the requirements in the design, and here's how you think about it. And by the way, that would include having a visible focus indicator, right? So you can see where you are, and it would include, you know, the fact that you can navigate through in a reasonable, all the things, right, that we think about as required, but they're just another part of the job. And I think until we reach that point, we can't properly marshal those resources.
Well, you've you've actually mentioned a lot of sort of brave ideas, or that's what I would call those. The first one is teach personnel as little about accessibility as you possibly can.
Yeah, actually, yes. Now, I actually think it's really important from a training standpoint that we teach people about disability. As a diversity dimension, I actually think the most important training we can do, honestly, is to teach people about disability. And the reason for that is that when we then go to people and we talk to people about, well, we have to make these things accessible for people with disabilities, we now are talking about something that they have some relationship to. I find that you know, there's a great I think it was a Far Side cartoon, which was what we say and what dogs hear. And it's just a 2-panel cartoon. In the first panel, there's a guy yelling at his dog. And he's going, you know, Ginger, bad dog, Ginger, you know, don't eat the food off the table, Ginger, you know, you don't make a mess, Ginger. He's just yelling at poor Ginger, right? The golden retriever. And in the next panel, it's what dogs hear. And there's blah, 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 Ginger, blah, 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 Ginger, blah, Ginger. And in a lot of ways, if you go to people and you say, well, we absolutely have to, you know, include and meet the needs of people with disabilities, it's blah, blah, blah. It's like, what's a person with a disability? Almost, you know, most people you will encounter in companies now are no older than 35 years old. Mm-hmm. They have been using technology since they were 3. You know, computer is complete. Who wouldn't use a computer, right? They're in the prime of their life, right? They can't imagine ever having to wear reading glasses or not being able to run and jump and do all sorts of things that they do now. And so in a lot of ways, the first thing you have to do is harness their imagination so that they understand the terms you're using and understand why that would matter. Because, you know, I mean, a lot of young people don't deal with people who are elderly very much. I'm really finding, right? You know, I've been asked at various times, you know, well, isn't not using a computer just a preference? Isn't disability, right? And it's literally, right? And so you if there's any training that's valuable, the most valuable training is first of all to define your terms and to create a picture in their imagination of why it is you're asking them to do these things and who the audience is, who the user base is. But then, so that's really understanding disability, but understanding accessibility is something that we can make a less, less of a, body of skill for most people, and more simply a body of practice that's incorporated into the jobs they already have. And returning to total quality management, right? This is really kind of the idea behind total quality management. It's like, if you think of quality control, first thing people think about with quality control is we're going to do an inspection, right? And this is what Deming called quality by inspection. And that's basically your site audit, right? So you build a website, or you author an electronic document, or you build a building, or you set up a servicing facility or whatever, and you completely finish it, and then the accessibility inspector comes in. And that's what most people's idea of quality control is. I'll come in, I'll see if you made it accessible or not. Well, if it's a building,
that's too late.
Right? We don't build buildings that way for accessibility, right? We have in the US, we have the 2010 standards for accessible design. We have local building codes. Architects and designers are trained in this. There's a plan that incorporates those. The plan is reviewed for accessibility. Then the building work is started. The architect comes on site. There are regular inspections to make sure the plans are being followed. And then by the time the city building inspector shows up to measure the width of your doorways and the height of your ramps and the accessibility of the bathrooms, you're probably 95 to 99% of the way there, right? Most of the time, there's anybody who's ever had a building inspection knows they come and they find like one thing, right? And you're happy because they found the one thing. But if you didn't start at the beginning and you're only doing this by inspection at the end, you're not going to get accessibility. And quality and accessibility are much the same that way. You don't get quality by building the cars however the heck you want, and then there's somebody who sits at the end of the line and sees if they're broken.
No,
right? You get low yield. That's called low yield. That's called a low yield problem, right? And so what you want is incorporating. We incorporate quality into manufacturing by looking, for example, at sources of quality breakdowns and looking, do we need to add automation? Do we need to improve automation? Do we need to change practices? Do we need to adjust how people do their jobs? Right? We engineer the jobs and the automation and the workplace and all those things in order to improve quality. And we need to do that the same way with accessibility. It is really a business process engineering problem in a lot of ways that needs to be informed by all of that brilliant craft expertise and all the subject matter expertise we have. But it is ultimately a question of an integration with process, not of totally changing hearts and minds and getting everybody to want to be an accessibility expert or inspecting all the time. Right? Inspections are important. You always should have checkpoints. Processes break down. Processes may have problems, but the inspections are to tell whether your process is working. The inspections are not to produce quality. Or accessibility. Right?
So what you're saying is that not every person who actually adds value to the accessibility needs to know how to spell the word accessibility. So he just needs to, do his or her job properly and in accordance with the rules, that includes accessibility by default. How about dedicated accessibility team? Is that supposed to include craftsmen and, those accessibility geniuses, or is it necessary?
I think it's absolutely necessary.
Okay.
And
so
today,
found the
I think
place for them.
It's really what we use them. It's really what they do, right? Today, those people are primarily testers, right? So they're primarily doing evaluations because nobody knows how to do an evaluation, right? So we need an expert to do an evaluation. There are people who are who are consulting, right? So they come in and they try to teach people how to do accessibility as part of that consulting engagement. So they're being deployed as a kind of patch, right? They're kind of the team that sort of runs around and tries to cover all the bases, but always seems to never have enough capacity and never have enough time. I think the best use of subject matter experts is to use them to bake their knowledge and experience into artifact, process, automation potentially, such that what their purpose is not so much to constantly do testing and audits and consulting, but to really drive that integration process in the first place. Now, if you have TQM in your company and you're doing, quality management, you still have QA testers. Right? I mean, you still are doing testing, right? You always do testing. You need audits. You need governance. You need, to be able to have a dashboard and have testing that can drive data into a dashboard so that your management can see how the company is doing, and to monitor kind of backsliding. Because backsliding can occur either in process or process observation. Backsliding can occur because the underlying platforms that our software and systems run on change, right? Apple in iOS 13 actually broke accessibility in VoiceOver. And a lot of people, who had not changed their software suddenly found that there were accessibility challenges. And TQM, Total Quality Management, is the acronym I'm using. Had a question about that. And so you still need people to do audits. You still need people to do testing, and you need people to work on process integration. You need a subject matter expert to review your design standards, because you have to make sure, number one, that they're comprehensive for WCAG considerations. Right? If you're doing digital, right? So you need to make sure they're comprehensive and that they include, for example, the requirements for keyboard interaction. You need to make sure that they are specifying colors and that those colors have all been checked to make sure they have that 4.5:1 contrast ratio, right? And so you always need a team of SMEs and craftsmen, but their orientation, I believe, and the most effective use of their time is to leverage their abilities by building them into process and artifact and tools, picking the right tools, setting them into the right processes, making sure those processes are stood up and integrated. That's where the real value comes, because now you can leverage your expertise. And in many ways, it's what we're doing today, right? We're having these webinars and creating the body of knowledge for a certification, because each of us knows things, and everybody on the team working on the certification comes from a particular body of experience and knowledge and has particular skills. Skills I don't have, other people have, right? Experience I have, some other people might not have. But what we're doing is we're pooling our experience and we're turning that into something that other people can learn from and to help them do in their jobs. And that leverages our knowledge a lot more than if I just went and, sat down and went through someone's website and told them what was broken. Not that isn't important, right? But it means that's at retail, right? So I get one website out of that. We do this work, and we do the work we do in the IAAP in terms of professional improvement. We are leveraging our knowledge and experience across hundreds or thousands of people. And it's similar in terms of, I think, how we have to approach the way that we use resources for accessibility in our organizations.
So again, what you're saying is that dedicated accessibility team should place more focus on, the accessibility testing as it is, subject matter experts, and on the documents rather than on the people. So don't go around bugging people. Just take the documents and revise them. Make sure that those, letters include, well, not letters. Then letters themselves shouldn't be probably mentioned accessibility, but rather the practice embeds accessibility, right? So the document is such that it basically doesn't give you space for inaccessible.
I'm sorry, can you ask that again?
Sorry, I was too, verbose. So what I'm saying is that the dedicated accessibility team basically needs to place a lot more emphasis on the documents rather than on people. So you don't go just around asking people to, to create accessible design, but rather you just, improve the documents. So the procedures, the documents themselves are full of implicit accessibility practices.
Yes, that's a great way to put it, actually. Yeah, that's a really great summary.
Okay. So documents, when you're talking about artifacts, can you dwell a little bit more about that? Like specifically, what do you mean?
So when I talk about artifacts, I really talk about, sort of concrete, actual kind of physical things, and either that or digital things that mimic physical things, right? So an example of an artifact might be a design specification, right? Or a visual design specification, or a interaction specification, or interaction plan, or a content specification. And those are typically where design is done in a formal way, right? And part of our challenges often is that we come into processes where these things have, and around websites, for example, historically, right? Websites have been built by geniuses too, right? And so the business goes, I need a website to do X, and often in smaller companies, right? I need a website to do X, and here's my vision, and you'll get on the whiteboard for a few minutes, and then the programmer is this like genius who is sort of a designer too. They're not quite a designer, but they kind of know how to lay out a screen and do that stuff. And so nobody ever writes down a formal design spec, right? And that's just a maturity issue for organizations in general anyway, right? Ultimately, that doesn't yield consistent design, and organizations go through a maturity curve in terms of their websites as well. But let's assume an organization that has gone through that kind of maturing process, and they do have a requirement for actual professional designers who are creating the visual interaction and content specifications. And those may take different forms in different organizations, right? We can't prescribe and say every organization needs these 3 documents. Okay? But there is information in those documents that every organization ultimately needs their programmers, their developers to have. Not just for accessibility, right? So let's forget accessibility for a moment and say just for website design, right? A sort of mature process will have those 3 elements that are presented in some form, right, to the person who ultimately writes the code in that organization. And that form may be different in different organizations. Roles may be structured or laid out differently in the design and development process in different organizations. But ultimately, that's the information you need to have a good website design. What color are things going to be? How are they going to be laid out? Do we have standards for things, right? How does the user interact? What are the interaction patterns, right? And these are the things that designers know about in their job. And so those design specifications are kind of artifact. And so when I use the word artifact, that's really kind of what I'm referring to. And so what we look at when the SMEs come in and they look at those artifacts, they say, okay, now I'm a WCAG SME. I know what information the developer is going to need in order to make something accessible. I know what additional kinds of information we have to make sure we have proper hygiene around in these things. And that's things like colors, right? What colors is the programmer going to code into those hex codes for the colors, right? What is the keyboard navigation order, right, for keyboard operability? What are the interaction patterns, and how do those patterns work? What about alt text? What about descriptions, right? There's all this content that even an accessibility aware developer needs to be included in those artifacts. And so that's a kind of artifact I'm talking about. Also, a design standard is an artifact. And coding standards and coding checklists are artifacts. And you need to look at the balance. Again, it's in many ways, it's an industrial engineering problem. What is the balance between giving people checklists or incorporating more into software, right? There's for example, just in WCAG testing, right? People who want to do testing or an audit or a test for WCAG conformance in a website, often, like step A, right? They're the shoemaker and they work from their head, right? I did this, my father did this, my grandfather did this before me. I know all the steps for making a shoe. I've never written it down. I learned it from my father, right? Step 2, I have a checklist of all the things I need to put in the shoe. Oops, needs a sole on the bottom. Otherwise people's feet get hurt, right? You've got the checklist, right? Third stage is maybe I have software, and we're starting to see these software packages now, which are so welcome, that walk someone through the process of doing testing, right? And so now you get into the question of, and again, these are really business process and automation questions, industrial engineering questions, if you have, is where does the knowledge reside? And what's the best place for the knowledge reside in terms of my efficient use of resources? Should I be putting a lot of people on this, or should I buy a computer program? Should I have a robot building part of the car instead of assembly line workers? And what are my trade-offs there? Right.
Nice.
But it really is that sort of issue. I'm getting a lot of questions and comments, by the way.
Okay, let's turn to those.
And actually, if you don't mind, I think I'm going to just dive into a couple of the questions.
Sure, go ahead.
I'm going to. Mark McGuire asked, is there a master checklist of accessibility artifacts for businesses and organizations?
That was precisely my question.
I know, I should really write a book. There isn't. I mean, part of the answer is there isn't, right? Is what you can do is you can give examples, right? But, your mileage may vary. Organizations differ in how they approach, for example, website design and creation. And so the actual artifact may differ. Depends on how much automation you want to deploy, right? Depends on, do you want it on paper? Do you want it just in a document, a checklist? Do you want to use a computer program, right? I think what you can say is you can give examples, and you can talk about the information that must flow, right? Or the information that must be considered, and then give examples of artifacts that might incorporate that. But that's where the leadership, I think, really comes in, and where the expertise comes in. And it's expertise and leadership, not just in accessibility, but again, on business process engineering.
And again, if I understand correctly, so that dedicated accessibility team's job is to sort of write that book specifically for your company, including its practices, its automation tools, its processes, and so on. Right?
Yeah. In some ways, I mean, the other analogy I would have to this is sort of ISO 9000. And I know Christopher and I have had this conversation at some meetings where I said, actually, certification for individuals is great, but if you look at how quality certifications are done, there's two kinds, right? There's your sort of black belt certifications for individuals, but then there's organizational certifications. And so I think what we're really in some ways trying to do with this certification for the strategic leader in accessibility is, I think we're also starting to lay out a lot of those organizational considerations by talking about the leadership role who is responsible for those considerations. So I hope that we'll see an increasing body of knowledge about how to do this. And like I said, maybe I should spend my retirement writing a book or something. But just going to another couple questions. A great question from Liz Wingnut, I assume the name is Liz, is how do you deal with old legacy systems that never had accessibility in mind? These are hard problems. And I think it's really important. I'm going to kind of answer that a little sideways. I'm going to say these remediate, right? There's sort of like process integration, which is everything I've been talking about today, But now you've raised a really good question, which is that, like in the real world, you have a lot of stuff that is already not accessible that people have purchased or built. You've got green screen systems, you have legacy web systems. I actually ran across a piece of software once that was written early in the development of the web, where apparently the style sheet stuff wasn't very sophisticated yet, and CSS the CSS spec was in its infancy, and so these people had every single label on the screen was a picture, because they just couldn't get the really nice visual appearance they wanted without just basically making every label a picture, right? So we have a lot of these, you see these across industries and sort of across the world. I think one of the most important things to do for hygiene, sort of process hygiene, is not to get too fixated on them.
Let's forget about them, right?
And well, no, not too fixated, right? You got to deal with it, right? But they're the shiny object, right? And often what you get is one of the things that you should be getting from the discussion today is that accessibility is a program. Accessibility isn't a project. And you don't need an accessibility leader if all you need to do is do a project and then you're accessible. You just need a project manager. And often that's what companies do, right? And we're kind of trying to change that. So accessibility is a program, not a project. Remediation is a project, really, right? I mean, that's going back and dealing with what you're going to do about all your historical shortfalls. I think it's really important that remediation doesn't suck all the oxygen out of the room and divert attention from process and integration. And so I think you clearly need to do something about these systems, but I think it's really important to maintain a balance, and because these things can suck up enormous amounts of resources. And again, they will in many organizations, if you have an organization with a really strong project management culture, which is a really great thing, right? Because you're really effective at doing projects, very, very key business skill, right? But but an organization that is more project and program oriented, what can happen is these legacy systems can just pull everything, all the management attention, all the resources, all the budget into these remediations, to the neglect of what I'm talking about here. And without what I'm talking about here, I don't think you can have sustainable accessibility or economically sustainable or operationally sustainable accessibility in an organization.
So the first priority on your list should be, building an accessibility system. And then if you have a little bit of extra resources, then go for it and try to remediate what's been, left without accessibility a long time ago. Is that more or less correct?
If you have the luxury, right?
Yeah.
Back on planet Earth, right? I think ideally, yes, because what's going to happen is if you fix your processes, many legacy systems will fix themselves over time.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Yeah, because sooner or later, those systems will be replaced by new ones. And if those new ones are accessible, then you're good to go. If those new ones aren't accessible, then you're stuck, more or less.
Exactly.
And then you will have to spend time remediating, again, your legacy systems.
Yeah. And what you end up is in this sort of cycle of endless remediation.
Right.
As you say, that's a fantastic description, Anatoliy. You just end up in the cycle of remediation. And by the way, the reputation that accessibility gets in your organization is accessibility is expensive and painful and hard, right? And
that's a common knowledge, I say.
But I don't think it's true, right? I mean, it's like saying quality is expensive and painful and hard. Well, yeah, if you're doing quality by inspection, right? And all your cars are like running, coming off the end of your line, and 30% of them won't start, right? You're going to spend a lot of money getting those 30% of cars to start. But if you just build them right in the first place, that's a lot cheaper and a lot less painful. By the way, your picture's frozen for a moment there, Anatoliy, but There you go. Looks like you're moving again.
Oh, well, that's great. Nice to hear that.
The internet.
By the way, yeah, here it is. Can I ask you also a question? Well, if you have like an entire infrastructure of various services and apps, and your core service is more or less, has, is built with accessibility in mind, but how do you deal with all the rest of your infrastructure with your like various services? How to squeeze the accessibility into those products? Is there any advice on your part?
Yeah, and I mean, we've talked a lot about digital, but I think this applies equally to physical world. And I think, physical world accessibility is something that in certain sectors is pretty easy to do now in the United States, at least, right? I can't speak to kind of how building codes are done in other countries. But I do know that in the US, that planning process that I described for buildings is one that is pretty well incorporated into new construction just because of local zoning, if nothing else. Right. I mean, threat of lawsuits is one thing here, but if you just look at what's now required in terms of local construction in most municipalities in the United States, this stuff's in the building codes, right? And again, that's incorporation into artifacts. You asked about artifacts, right? A building code is an artifact, right? The 2010 standards for accessible design is an artifact. But then you talk more broadly about services that are delivered in the physical world. There's a lot more to it than buildings, right? And it's how you operate those spaces, right? If you've got a great accessible building with wide doorways and great ramps and terrific restrooms, right? And you put the furniture in and block all the paths of travel internally, that's just great that the person in the wheelchair can get through the front door, but they're not going to get to the counter, right? Or to the reception desk, right? And there's funny stories. There was a webinar. I don't know if it might have been one of the IAP or maybe one. I think it was another vendor webinar where someone just talked about maintenance of internal facilities, and they showed a picture of somebody where the handicapped stall in the restroom had been turned into somebody's office. And I mean, and by the way, if I were that person, I'd get the message, right? But they had actually literally moved someone's office into the handicapped stall, right? And so there's internal maintenance, and there's also just how you design services. And so the same things that apply to the design of websites really applies to the considerations when you're designing services. So if I'm a product manager and I'm developing something that has servicing components, say multi-channel servicing components. I've got, I might be servicing it by telephone. I might be servicing it by website. I might even have some kind of mail facility or whatever, right? If I have the proper personas in my process there, I'm saying, okay, I have a persona here for, say, an elderly person. Right. And that elderly person, if anybody knows, like my late father, for example, so wanted to use a computer. He would call me up all the time. I'm trying to figure out how to use a computer. Help me. Right. Should I buy this computer? Should I buy that computer? Could I get voice control software? Because I can't type. Right. He bought a computer, then he bought another computer. He spent like 2 decades trying to learn how to use a computer, never succeeded. And again, if you have a persona for somebody like that in your toolkit, right, in your artifacts, as a product manager, you're going to say, I can't assume that everybody can use a computer. And if this is a product, now it's one thing if it's a digital only product, right? I mean, if it's Twitter, don't worry about it, right? Like that's all Twitter is. It runs on a computer, right? But if you've got stuff that crosses, like physical world and virtual world, and fundamentally is a general purpose product, you got to be thinking about those personas, and you got to, you should be thinking in your servicing channel design, for example. Do I have servicing channels that can provide, as what the ADA calls reasonable accommodation? Right? How do I accommodate people with disabilities in my process? And that has to be, and again, that's something that's hard to engineer in after the fact, because you might have to stand up a whole servicing channel just to provide an accommodation if you hadn't thought about this in front. And again, accessibility is hard and expensive and burdensome, right? When you have to do it after the fact. So I think it really applies. You have to be prepared. Like if you have a situation where you have to be able to provide sign language interpreters, if you have to be able to provide the kind of real-time interpretation and captioning that we have on this webinar for if you have customers with disabilities who need real-time information, and that's normally conveyed by a phone call or a Zoom meeting. Have you planned those things in advance? And so anytime we look at interacting with or servicing human beings, right? Whether it's, we're building a website or a digital service, or authoring a PDF document, or setting up a call center, right? There's accessibility considerations in all of those, and they should be built into the personae and the processes and the considerations that people use in their jobs every day. I'm going to jump, by the way, to a question, because somebody asked me a question about training, and I think this dovetails with training. And again, I think you train for awareness and knowledge of disability, and of disability as a diversity dimension, and of how to treat people with disabilities. You fill in the blanks for people so that they then can understand the other things that we're telling them. I think that's the most useful kind of training. It's not the only, but it's the most useful. Go ahead. I know we're almost out of time too. Sorry, go ahead.
The actual point basically is that you don't, run accessibility trainings, but rather diversity trainings. There are persons with disabilities. That's important to know and to keep in mind.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
That's the idea.
I mean, I have had experiences talking to software vendors where we were talking about the fact that we needed people with certain disabilities to be able to use their software, right? We needed to have it such that people with certain disabilities. And we were specifically talking, I think in this case, about like low vision and range of motion, right? So keyboard operator, keyboard only operation, and, just proper WCAG conformance for low vision. And the vendor said to me, well, then you'll have to indemnify us. And I said, what? For what? They said, oh, for errors. And this is stunning, right? And that's the awareness of that a person with a disability is not someone who's going to make more mistakes, right? It's like, but that's basic stuff, right? And this is the ground you have to prepare with training, I think, and that you only can really do with training, right?
Well, yeah, I frankly still think that the person who organized their office in the restroom that is supposed to be accommodating this persons with disabilities. That's a compliment to the architect and to how that restroom is laid out. It's very convenient to have office like that. I know. So why not? Sure.
It's a big, comfortable space and it has a sink.
Right. So, sink and whatnot. Okay, are there any more questions maybe? Because we really have 2.5 minutes or so to the end of our hour.
So good question here about how do you get accessibility closer to cyber security in your corporate priority list? And I think, that's probably a whole webinar.
Yeah, meet us.
We should schedule
Thursday.
a webinar.
Right.
So, okay, I think we're probably mostly out of time.
Yeah.
So, thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it. And
Anatoly,
thanks so much for the wonderful questions and
for your wonderful interruptions. You wanted to say, well, yeah, whenever,
This is Christopher. Thank you both very much. This was an excellent presentation. And again, Rachel, you want to jump in to close us out?
Yes, I just want to say thank you again to Anatoliy and Daniel for joining us today. And if you're not an IAAP member and you're interested in getting engaged with the Strategic Leader in Accessibility Community of Practice, you can find out more about on our website about membership and how you can get engaged and involved. We'd love to have you. I wanted to thank our interpreters today and our captionists for joining us. And this webinar recording should be up on our YouTube channel by tomorrow.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Anatoliy. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, the interpreters and the captionists. Have a great rest of the day. Take care.
Thanks for having us. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.